Prelude. My sister Cass ran away the morning of my 16th birthday. She left my present, wrapped and sitting outside my bedroom door, and stuck a note for my parents under the coffee maker. None of us heard her leave. I was dreaming when I woke up suddenly to the sound of my mother screaming. I ran to my door, threw it open, and promptly tripped over my gift, whacking my face on the hall light switch. My face was aching as I got to my feet and ran down the hall to the kitchen where my mother was standing by the coffee maker with Cass's note in her hand. "I just don't understand this," she was saying shakily to my father, who was standing beside her in his pajamas without his glasses on. The coffee maker was spitting and gurgling happily behind him, like this was any other morning. "She can't leave! She can't!" "Let me see the note," my father said calmly, taking it out of her hand. It was on Cass's thick, monogrammed stationery with matching envelopes. I had the same ones, same initials, C.O. Later, when I read it, I saw it was completely concise and to the point. Cass was not the type to waste words. "Mom and Dad, I want you to know first that I'm sorry about this. Someday I hope I'll be able to explain it well enough so that you'll understand. Please don't worry. I'll be in touch. I love you both. Cass." My mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at me. "She's gone," she said. "She went to be with him. I know it. How could she do this? She's supposed to be at Yale in 2 weeks. "Margaret," my father said, squinting at the note, "calm down." The him was Cass's new boyfriend, Adam. He was 21, had a goatee, and lived in New York, working with the Lamont Whippers show. It was one of those shock talk shows where people tell their boyfriends they've been sleeping with their best friends, and guests routinely include Klansmen and 80-pound 4-year-olds. Adam's job mostly consisted of getting the coffee, picking up people at the airport, and pulling guests off each other during the frequent fights and that scored the show big ratings. Since she'd come home from the beach 3 weeks ago, she'd met Adam there. Cass had been glued to the TV each day at 4 p.m., wishing aloud for a good fight just so she could catch a glimpse of him. Usually she did, smiling at the sight of him charging on stage, his face serious to untangle 2 scrapping sisters or a couple of rowdy cross-dressers. My father put down the note on the table and walked to the phone. "I'm calling the police," he said. And my mother burst into tears again, her hands rising to her face, over her shoulder, through the glass door, and over to the patio. I could see our neighbors, Boo and Stuart Connell. They were cutting through the tree line that separated our houses for my birthday brunch. Boo had a bouquet of fresh-cut zinnias, bright and colorful, in her hand. "I just can't believe this," my mother said to me, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the table. She was shaking her head. "What if something happens to her? She's only 18. "Yes, hello? I'm calling to report a missing person," my father said suddenly in his official Dean of Students voice. "Cassandra O'Caron?" "Yes, she's my daughter." I had a sudden memory pop into my head. My mother standing in the doorway of Cass's and my childhood room, back when we had twin beds and pink wallpaper. She would always kiss us, then stand in the doorway after turning off the light, her shadow stretching down the length of the room between us. She was always the last thing I tried to see before I fell asleep. "See you in Dreamland," she'd whisper, and blow us a kiss before shutting the door quietly behind us. Like Dreamland was a real place, tangible, where we would all wander close enough to catch glimpses and brush shoulders. I always went to sleep determined to go there, to find her and Cass, and sometimes I did, but it was never the way I imagined it would be. Now my mother sat weeping as my father reported Cass's vital statistics. 5'4", brown hair, brown eyes, mole on left cheek, and I had the sudden seeking feeling that Dreamland might be the only place we'd be seeing her for a while. I'd heard a knock and looked up to see Boo and Stuart standing on the patio waving at us. They'd been our neighbors for as long as I could remember, since before Cass or I was even born. They were former hippies, now New Agers. They believed in massage, fresh-baked homemade bread, and the Dalai Lama. They had absolutely nothing in common with my parents, except proximity, which had led to 18 years of being neighbors and our best family friends. "Good morning," Boo called out through the door, holding up flowers for me to see. "Happy birthday!" She reached down and pushed the door open, then stepped inside with Stuart following. He was carrying a bowl and a plate, each covered with a brightly colored napkin, which he put down on the table in front of my mother. "We bought blueberry buckwheat pancake mix and sliced mangoes," Stuart said in his soft voice, smiling at me. "Your favorites." Boo was crossing the room, arms already extended, to pull me close for a tight, long hug. "Happy birthday, Caitlin," she whispered in my ear. She smelled like bread and incense. "This will be your best year yet. I can feel it." "Don't count on it," I said, and she pulled back and frowned at me, confused, just as my father hung up the phone and cleared his throat. "Technically," he said, "they can't do anything for 24 hours, but they're keeping an eye out for her. We need to call all her friends right now. Maybe she told them something." "What's going on?" Boo asked, and at the table my mother just shook her head. She couldn't even say it. "Margaret, what is it?" "It's Cassandra," my father told her, his voice flat. "It appears that she's run away." That was my father, always formal. He lived for supposedlies and theoreticallys, not believing anything without proper proof. "Oh my God," Boo said, pulling out a chair and yanking it close to my mother before sitting down. "When did she go?" "I don't know," my mother said softly, and Boo took one of her hands, rubbing the fingers with her own, and Stuart moved to stand behind her, his hand on her shoulder. They were touchy people, always had been. My father, however, was not, so neither made a move towards him. My mother sniffled. "I don't know anything." "Caitlin," my father said to me briskly, "get a list together of her friends, anyone that might have talked to her, and the number for that Witters show or whatever it's called." "Okay," I said, not bothering to correct him. He nodded before turning his back to my mother and Boo and Stuart to look out across the patio at the few squirrels crowding the bird feeders. On my way back to my room, I picked up the present from where it was laying in the middle of the hallway. It was wrapped in blue paper with no card, but I knew it was from Cass. She would have never forgotten my birthday. I took it into my room and sat down on my bed. In the mirror over my bureau, I could see my face was scratched from where I hit the light switch, the skin around it bright pink. No one had even noticed. I unwrapped Cass's present slowly, folding the paper carefully as I slipped it off. It was a book, and as I turned it over to read the letters on the cover, Dream Journal. All around the words were comets and stars and moons and suns, scattered across a light purple background. It was beautiful. The first page was an introduction about dreams, what they mean and why we should remember them. This was Cass's thing. She had been big into symbols and signs in the last year. She said you never knew what the world was trying to tell you, and that you had to pay attention every second. As I closed the cover, something caught my eye on one of the first pages. It was an inscription in Cass's loopy script, my name big, the message little. "Caitlin," it said in black ink. "I'll see you there." Chapter 1. When I was 4 and Cass was 6, she whacked me across the face with a plastic shovel at our neighborhood park. We were in the sandbox, and it was winter. In the pictures, we were in matching coats and hats and mittens. My mother loved to dress us alike, like twins, since we were only 2 years apart. We did look alike, with the same round face and dark eyes and the same brown hair, but we weren't the same, even then. The story goes like this. Cass had the shovel, and I wanted it. My mother was sitting watching us on a bench with Boo, who had her camera and was snapping pictures. This was at Commons Park, the small grassy area in the center of our neighborhood, Lakeview. Beside the sandbox, it also had a swing set, one of those circular things you push real fast and then jump on a kind of manual merry-go-round, and enough grass to play baseball or kickball. Cass and I spent most of the afternoons of our childhood at Commons Park, but the shovel incident is what we both always remembered. Not that we ourselves recalled it that well. We had just heard the story recounted so many times over the years that it was easy to take the details and fold them into our own sparse memories, embellishing here or there to fill the blanks. It is said that I reached for the shovel, and Cass wouldn't give it to me, so I grabbed her hand and tried to yank it away. A struggle ensued, which must have looked harmless until Cass somehow scraped one hard plastic edge across my temple, and it began to bleed. This moment, the moment we have documented in one of Boo's pictures. There is one picture of Cass and me playing happily, another of the struggle over the shovel. I'm wailing, my mouth a perfect O, while Cass looks stubborn and determined, always a fighter. And finally, a shot of her arm extended, the shovel against my face, and a blur in the left corner which I know is my mother jumping to her feet and running to the sandbox to pull us apart. Apparently, there was a lot of blood. My mother ran through the winding sidewalks of Lakeview with me in her arms, shrieking, then took me to the hospital where I received 5 tiny stitches. Cass got to stay at Boo and Stewart's, eat ice cream, and watch TV until we got home. The shovel was destroyed. My mother, already a nervous case, wouldn't let us leave the house or play with anything not plush or stuff for about 6 months. And I grew up with a scar over my eye, small enough that hardly anyone ever noticed it, except for me and Cass. As we grew older, I'd sometimes look up to find her peering very closely at my face, finding the scar with her eyes before reaching up with one hand to trace it with her finger. She always said it made her feel horrible to look at it, even though we both knew it wasn't really her fault. It was just one more thing we had in common, like our faces, our gestures, and our initials. When Cass was born, my mother still wasn't sure what to name her. My mother had suffered terrible morning sickness, and Boo, who had moved in next door during the 4th month or so, spent a lot of time making herbal tea and rubbing my mother's feet, trying to make her force down the occasional saltine cracker. Boo was the one who suggested Cassandra. In Greek mythology, she was a seer, a prophet, she told my mother, whose tendencies leaned more towards Alice or Mary. Of course, she came to a horrible end, but in Greek mythology, who doesn't? Besides, what more could you want for your daughter than to be able to see her own future? So Cassandra it was. By the time I came along, my mom and Boo were best friends. Boo's real name was Catherine, but she hated it, so I was named Caitlin, the Irish version. Cass's name was always cooler, but to be named for Boo was something special, so I never complained. Her name was just one thing I envied about Cass. Even with all our similarities, it was one of the things we didn't have in common that I was always most aware of. My sister wasn't a seer or a prophet, at least not at 18. What she was student body president 2 years running, star right wing of the girls' soccer team, state champs her junior and senior year, and homecoming queen. She volunteered chopping vegetables at the homeless shelter for soup every Thursday, had been skydiving twice, and was famous in our high school for staging a sit-in to protest the firing of a popular English teacher for assigning questionable reading material, Toni Morrison's beloved. She made the local news for that one, speaking clearly and angrily to a local reporter, her eyes blazing, with half the school framed in the shot cheering behind her. My father, in his recliner, just sat there and grinned. There were only 2 times I can ever remember seeing Cass really depressed. One was after the state championships sophomore year, when she missed the goal that could have won it all. She locked herself in the room for a full day. She never talked about it again. Instead, just focusing on the next season, when she rectified the loss by scoring the only 2 goals of the championship game. The second time was at the end of her junior year, when the first real boyfriend, Jason Packer, dumped her so he could see other people and enjoy his freedom in his last summer before college. Cass cried for a week straight, sitting on her bed in her bathrobe and staring out of the window, refusing to go anywhere. She drew back from everyone a bit, spending a lot of time next door with Boo, where they drank tea, discussed Zen Buddhism, and read dream books together. This was when Cass became so spiritual, scanning the world around her for signs and symbols, sure that there had to be a message for her somewhere. She got into 3 of the 4 schools she applied to and ended up choosing Yale. My parents were ecstatic and threw a party to celebrate. We all applauded and cheered as she bent over to slice a big cake that read, "Watch out, Yale, here comes Cass," which my mother had ordered special from a bakery in town. But Cass wasn't herself. She smiled and accepted all the pats on the back, rolling her eyes now and then at my parents' pride and excitement, but it seemed to me that she was just going through the motions. I wondered if she was looking for a sign, something she couldn't find with us, or even at Yale. She stayed in this funk all the way through graduation. In mid-June, she went to stay with her friend Mindy's family at the beach and got a job renting out beach chairs by the boardwalk every day. 3 mornings into it, she met Adam. He was down at the beach on vacation with some friends from the show and rented a chair from her. He stayed all day, then asked her out. I could tell when she called the next morning. Her voice was so happy and laughing over the line that our cast was back. But not, we soon learned, for long. I don't think any of us knew how much we needed Cass until she was gone. All we had was her room, her stories, and the quiet that settled in as we tried in vain to spread ourselves out and fill the space she'd left behind. Everyone forgot my birthday as our kitchen became mission control, full of ringing phones, loud voices, and panic. My mother refused to leave the phone, positive Cass would call any minute and say it was all a joke. Of course she was still going to yell. Meanwhile, my mother's friends from the PTA and Junior League circled through the house making fresh pots of coffee every 5 minutes, wiping the counters down and clucking their tongues in packs by the back door. My father shut himself in his office to call everyone who'd ever known Cass, hanging up each time to cross another name off the long list in front of him. She was 18, so technically she couldn't be listed as a runaway. She was more like a soldier gone AWOL, still owing some service and on the lam. They'd already tried Adam's apartment in New York, but their number had been disconnected. Then they called the Lamont Shipper Show, where they kept getting an answering machine, encouraging them to leave their experience with this week's topic. My twin dresses like a slut, and I can't stand it, so that a staffer could get back to them. I can't believe she'd do this, my mother kept saying. Yale! She's supposed to be at Yale! And all the heads around her would nod, or hand her more coffee, or cluck again. I went into Cass's room and sat on her bed, looking around at how neatly she'd left everything. In a stack by the bureau was everything she and my mother had bought on endless Saturday trips to Walmart for college: pillowcases, a fan, a little plastic basket to hold her shower stuff, hangers, and her new blue comforter still in its plastic bag. I wondered how long she'd known she wouldn't use any of this stuff when she'd hatched this plan to be with Adam. She fooled us all, everyone. She had come home from the beach tan, gorgeous, and sloppy in love, and proceeded to spend about an hour each night on the phone long distance with him, spending every bit of the money she'd made that summer. I love you, she'd whisper to him, and I'd blush. She didn't even care that I was there. She'd be lying across the bed, twirling and untwirling the cord around her wrist. No, I love you more. I do. Adam, I do. Okay, good night. I love you. What? More than anything. Anything, I swear. Okay, I love you too. And when she finally did hang up, she'd pull her legs up against her chest, grinning stupidly, and sigh. You're pathetic, I told her one night when it was particularly sickening, involving about 20 I love yous and 4 pumpkins. Oh, Caitlin, she said, sighing again, rolling over on the bed and sitting up to look at me. Someday this will happen to you. God, I hope not, I said. If I act like that, be sure to put me out of my misery. Oh, really? She said, raising one eyebrow. Then, before I could react, she lunged towards me and grabbed me around the waist, pulling me down onto the bed with her. I tried to wriggle away, but she was strong, laughing in my ear as we fought. Give, she said in my ear. She had a lock hold on my wrist. Go on, say it. Okay, okay, I said, laughing. I give. I could feel her breathing against the back of my neck. Caitlin, Caitlin, she said in my ear, one arm still thrown over my shoulder, holding me there. She reached up with her finger and traced the scar over my eyebrow. I closed my eye, breathing in. Cass always smelled like ivory soap and fresh air. You're such a pain in the ass, she whispered to me, but I love you anyways. Likewise, I said. That had been 2 weeks earlier. She had to have known even then she was leaving. I walked to her mirror and looked at all the ribbons and pictures she had taped around it. Spelling bees, honor roll, shots from the mall, photo booth of her friends making faces and laughing, their arms looped around each other. There were a couple of us, too. one from Christmas when we were kids, both of us in little red dresses and white tights holding hands, and one from a summer at the lake when we were sitting at the end of the dock, legs dangling over in our matching blue polka dot bathing suits, eating popsicles. On the other side of the wall in my room, I had the same bed, the same bureau set, and the same mirror. But on my mirror, I had one picture of my best friend, Rena, my third-place ribbon from horseback riding, and my certificate from the B honor roll. Most people would have been happy with that, but for me, with Cass always blazing the trail ahead, there was nothing to do but pale in comparison. Okay, so maybe I was jealous now and then, but I could never have hated Cass. She came to all my competitions, cheering the loudest as I went for the bronze. She was the one waiting for me when I came off the ice during my only skating competition after falling on my ass 4 times in 5 minutes. She didn't even say anything, just took off her mittens, gave them to me, and helped me back to the dressing rooms where I cried in private as she unlaced my skates, telling knock-knock jokes the whole time. To be honest, a part of me had been looking forward to Cass going off to Yale at the end of the summer. I thought her leaving might actually give me some growing room, a chance to finally strike out on my own. But this changed everything. I'd always counted on Cass to lead me. She was out there somewhere, but she'd taken her own route, and for once I couldn't follow. But this time, she'd left me to find my own way. Chapter 2. The next morning when I woke up, I realized I hadn't dreamed at all, not even one fleeting image. I took the book Cass gave me out from under my bed where I'd hidden it, and opened it to the first page. There was a drawing of a full moon sprinkled with stars in the corner. August 18th, I wrote at the top of the page. Nothing last night, and you're still gone. I couldn't think of anything else, so I got out of bed, threw on some clothes, and went down to the hallway to the kitchen. The door to my parents' room was closed, and my father was in his office on the phone. He had to have talked to 100 people in the last 24 hours. "I understand that," he was saying, his voice level, but I could tell he was frustrated. "But 18 or not, we want her home. She's not the kind of girl who does something like this." The door to his office was half open, and I could see him standing by the window, running his palm over the small bald patch at the back of his head. My father, as the dean of students at the university, dealt with problems every day. He was the stand-in parent for thousands of undergraduates, and was quoted each time a fraternity got caught pulling pranks or a beer bash got out of hand. But this was different. This was about us. I pulled the patio door open and slipped outside, where it was thickly hot and muggy, another August morning, but at least it was quiet. Next door, I could see Boo and Stuart sitting at their kitchen table eating breakfast. Boo raised her hand, waved, and then gestured for me to come over, smiling. I took one look back at my own house, where my mother's stress filled the rooms to the ceiling, leaving a stink and heaviness like smoke, and started across the one strip of green grass that separated their backyard from ours. When I was little and got in trouble and sent to my room, I'd always sit on the bed and wish that Boo and Stuart were my parents. They never had kids of their own. My mother said it's because they acted so much like children themselves, but I like to think it was so that they could be there for me if I ever needed to trade my own family. The window in my room faced their back sun porch, an all-glass room where Boo kept most of her plants. She was mad for ferns. Stuart's studio he taught art at the university was just off that room, in what was supposed to be the living room. They kept their bed in the corner, and they didn't even have any real furniture to speak of. When you were invited over, you sat on the big red velvet cushions decorated with sequins that Boo had picked up on a trip to India. This drove my conservative mother crazy, so Boo and Stuart almost always came to our house, where Mom could relax among the safety and comfort of her ottomans and end tables. But that was what Cass and I loved so much about them. Their house, their lives, even their names. "Mr. Connell's my father, and he lives in California," Stuart always said. He was a mild and quiet man, quite brilliant, whose hair was always sticking straight up like a mad scientist, and flecked with various colors of paint. For most of the nights of my life, I could hear Stuart coming home late from his university studio, the brakes of his bike that they had an old VW bus, but it broke down constantly, squeaking all the way from the bridge down the street. He'd glide down the slope of the yard, under the clothesline, to the garage. Sometimes he forgot about the clothesline and almost killed himself, flying backward while the bike went on, unmanned, to crash against the garage door. You think they would have moved the clothesline after the second time or so, but they didn't. "It's not the fault of the clothesline," Stuart explained to me one day, rubbing the red burned spot on his neck. He'd broken his glasses again and had them taped together in the middle. "It's about me respecting it as an obstacle." Now Boo slid their door open and came out to meet me on the patio. She was in a pair of overalls, a faded red tank top underneath, and her feet were bare. Her long red hair was piled on top of her head, a few chopsticks stuck in here and there to hold it in place. Inside, Stuart was sitting at the table, eating a big peach and reading a book. He looked up and waved at me. He had juice all over his chin. "So?" Boo said, putting an arm around my shoulder. "How are things on the home front?" "Awful," I said. "Mom won't stop crying." She sighed, and we stood there for a few minutes, just looking across their yard. Boo had gone through a Japanese garden stage a few years back, which resulted in a footbridge and a fat, rusted iron Buddha sculpture. "I just can't believe she didn't tell me anything," I said. "I feel like I should have known something was going on." Boo sighed, reaching to tuck a piece of hair behind her ear. "I think she probably didn't want to put you in that position," she said, squatting down to pull a dandelion at the edge of the patio, lifting it to her face to breathe in the scent. "It was a big secret to keep." "I guess." Someone was mowing their lawn a few yards down, the motor humming. "I just thought everything was perfect for her, like it always was, you know?" Boo nodded, standing up and stretching her back. "Well, that's a lot of pressure, being perfect, right?" I shrugged. "I wouldn't know." "Me neither," she said with a smile. "But I think it was harder for Cass than we realized, maybe, so it's easy to get caught up in what people expect of you. Sometimes you can just lose yourself." She walked to the edge of the patio, bending down to pull another dandelion. I watched her, then said, "Boo?" "Yes?" "Did she tell you she was going?" She stood up slowly. "No," she said, as the lawnmower droned on down the street. "She didn't. But Cass had a hard year last year. Things weren't always as easy as she made them seem, Caitlin. It's important that you know that." I watched her pull a few more flowers, adding them to the bunch in her hand, before she came over and squeezed my shoulder. "What a crappy birthday, huh?" she said. I shrugged. "It doesn't matter. I wouldn't have done anything anyways." "What about Rena?" She said. "She's off with her new stepdad," I told her, and she shook her head. "Bermuda this time. My best friend Rena Swain's mom had just gotten remarried again. This was number 4. She only married rich, and never for love, which led to Rena living in nicer and nicer houses, going to endless exotic places, and piling up huge therapy bills. Rena had what Boo called issues, but the guys at school had another name for it. "Well, come inside," Boo said, pulling the door open and stepping back to let me in first. "Let me make you breakfast, and we'll not talk about any of this at all." I sat down at the table next to Stuart, who had finished his peach and was now sketching on the back of the power bill envelope, while Boo filled a mason jar with water and arranged the dandelions in it. Stuart's canvases, both finished and unfinished, covered the walls and were stacked against any solid surface in the house. Stuart did portraits of strangers. All his work was based on the theory that art was about the unfamiliar. Stuart might have been unconventional, but his art classes were insanely popular at the university. This was mostly because he didn't believe in grades or criticism and was a strong proponent of co-ed massage as a way of getting in touch with your artistic spirit. My father had been quoted about Stuart's teaching practices more than once, and always used words like unique, free spirit, an artistic choice. Privately, he wished Stuart would wear a tie now and then and stop leading meditation workshops in the quad on big football weekends. Stuart looked over and smiled at me. How's it feel to be 16? No big difference, I said. With all the confusion, my father had forgotten about taking me to get my driver's license, but everyone had been so crazy I hadn't wanted to ask. Oh, now, he said, pushing the envelope away and putting down his pen. That's the great thing about aging. It just gets better every year. Here you go, Boo said, plunking a plate down in front of me. Scrambled tofu, bacon, and some pomegranates. I remember when I was 16, Stuart said, sitting back in the chair. His feet were bare, too, and sprinkled with green paint. I hitched a ride to San Francisco and had a burrito for the first time. It was incredible. Really? I said, picking up the envelope he'd been doodling on. It was just half a face, sketchily drawn. I turned it over and was startled to see something in Cass's writing. Her name, doodled in blue, signed with a flourish as if she'd been sitting in the same chair some other morning eating scrambled tofu just like me. Just being free out on the open road, the world wide open. He leaned closer to me, but I was still looking at Cass's name. Suddenly so sad I felt like I couldn't breathe. It seemed impossible that Cass had been planning to change her life completely while none of us even noticed. Even when she doodled on that envelope, it could have been on her mind. Anything possible, Stuart was saying. Anything at all. I blinked and swallowed over the lump in my throat. I wanted to keep that envelope and hold it close to me, like it suddenly was all I had left of her, some sort of living part pulsing in my head. Caitlin, Boo said, coming over and bending down beside me. What is that? She leaned down and saw the envelope, catching her breath. Oh, honey, she said. And even before she wrapped her arms around me, I was already leaning in, tucking my head against her shoulder as she held me, as I knew she'd held Cass, in this same chair at this same table in this same light on other mornings, but not like this. When I walked up to our sliding glass door, the phone was ringing. No one seemed to be around, so I picked it up. Hello? There was silence, with just a bit of buzzing. Hello? My father appeared in the garage door, out of breath. He'd been outside, in the garage. Who is it? I shook my head. I don't. He was immediately beside me, pulling the receiver out of my hand. Cassandra, is that you? Jack? My mother said from their bedroom. I could hear her moving, coming closer, and then she appeared in the hallway, clutching a tissue, one hand over her mouth. I dozed off. Is it... Cassandra, listen to me. You have to come home. We're not mad at you, but you have to come home. His voice was shaking. Let me talk to her, my mother said, coming closer, but he shook his head, holding out one hand to keep her there. Tell her we love her, my mother said, and I couldn't stand the way her voice sounded, unsure and wavering. I slipped around them and into my room, slowly picking up my own phone. On the line, no one was speaking. Cassandra, my father said finally, talk to me. Silence. I pictured her standing in a phone booth by a highway, cars whizzing by. A place I'd never seen in a world I didn't know. Then suddenly I heard her voice. Daddy? She began, and I heard my father take in a breath, quickly, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. I'm okay. I'm happy. But I'm not coming home. Where are you? He demanded. Let me talk to her, my mother shrieked in the background. She could have gone into my father's office and picked up the extension there, but I knew she wasn't thinking of that. Couldn't even move from that spot in the hallway where she was standing. Cassandra! Don't worry about me, Cass said. No, my father said. You must come home. This is what I want, she said. You have to respect that. You're only 18, my father told her. This is ridiculous. You can't possibly know. Daddy, she said, and I realized suddenly I was crying again. The receiver wet against my face. I'm sorry. I love you. Please tell Mom not to worry. No, my father said firm. We are not. Caitlin, she said suddenly. I know you're there. I can hear you. What is she saying? My mom kept asking, now close to the receiver. Where is she? Margaret, just hold on, my father told her. Yes, I whispered back to Cass. I'm here. Don't cry, okay? She said. The line crackled, and I thought of her tickling me that night, her breath against my neck, laughing in my ear. I love you. I'm sorry about your birthday. It's nothing, I said. There was a voice outside her end, a yell, and another buzz on the line. Is that him? My father demanded. Is he there? I have to go, she said. Please don't worry, okay? God damn it, Cassandra, my father said. Don't you hang up this phone. Goodbye, she said softly as my father's voice dropped away. Goodbye. Cassandra! My mother wailed into the phone, all the anger and fear of the last 24 hours bursting across the line. Please! Click. And then she was gone. Chapter 3. By the time I had started school 2 days later, we hadn't heard from Cass again. The first call had come from somewhere in New Jersey, but beyond that there was a whole world that could have swallowed her up. I still didn't have anything I thought worthy of being entered into my journal. I was waiting for that something that was meaningful, real, a night when I saw Cass and she spoke to me, but instead my dreams were as dull as my everyday life, consisting mostly of me walking around the mall or school looking for some undetermined thing that I could never find while faces blurred in front of me. I woke up tired and frustrated and felt like I never got any sleep at all. My mother kept Cass's bedroom door shut with all of her Yale stuff piled up on the bed, waiting for her. I was the only one who ever went in there, and when I did, the air always smelled stale and strange, pent up like somehow the sorrow my mother carried in her shoulders, her heart, and her face. She was taking it the hardest. My mother had spent the last 18 years just as involved in Cass's activities as Cass was herself. She sewed sequin after sequin on ballet costumes, made Rice Krispie treats by the panful for soccer team bake sales, and chaperoned debate club bus trips. She knew Cass's playing stats, SAT scores, and GPA by heart. She'd been prepared to be just as involved long distance. A copy of Cass's Yale schedule was already taped to our refrigerator. My mother, a member of the parents' organization, plane tickets pre-bought for a parents' weekend in October. But now, in claiming her own life, Cass had taken part of my mother's as well. I got my license, finally, and without comment was given the keys to Cass's car. It was due to be mine anyway, since she couldn't have taken it to Yale, but it still felt strange. I put all her tapes and the Mardi Gras beads that she'd hung on the rearview mirror into a box and stuck it in the corner of the garage under a patio chair and some flower pots. It seemed like I couldn't do anything without thinking about her. The scar over my eye was the first thing I noticed in the mirror's reflection now. As for my father, he threw himself into the work. With a new semester, he was now busy with a class of incoming freshmen, a set of demonstrations over a controversial speaker, and a group of football players who had started a brawl at a local dance bar. He couldn't fix the problem of Cass running away, but through work, he could still do his daily miracles, soothing tensions and reassuring nervous administrators. Whenever I see my father in my mind, he is wearing a tie. They were the only gifts Cass and I ever gave him for his birthday, Christmas, and Father's Day, year after year. In all, he owned hundreds by now, the collection carefully hung and organized in his closet by color and degree of loudness. During our grade school years, we were enamored with polka dots and big stripes. It had become somewhat of a family joke at this point, and we'd taken to wrapping them in strangely shaped boxes and tubes, even folded up in a tiny jewelry box just to make things more interesting. But he wore each of them, proudly, each day to work, and prided himself on remembering not only the giver and the occasion, but the year as well. If my mother was the emotion of our family, he was the fact keeper. He remembered everything. "Caitlin, Christmas, 1998, he'd say, smoothing his hand proudly over a tie I myself didn't even recognize. "You had the chicken pox." The other thing my father loved, besides ties and us, was sports. Whenever the university basketball or football team played, Cass and I would find our way into the living room and plant ourselves on the floor at his feet to watch and scream and trash the refs together. It was the only time we got to see him lose his cool, get so emotional and ecstatic, and we loved it. The rest of the time, he was like the player with nerves of steel. The only person you want to get the ball to when it's a tie game with only 7 seconds left. He'd never let you down. But now Cass had done something to him. An intentional foul. Illegal movement, the biggest of penalties. I'd been there the day Yale called to check on whether Cass was still coming and saw my father's face as he explained no, not this semester. Then he sat back down in the chair to watch baseball while I went to her room and sat on her bed, breathing in the pent-up air, and pictured that world too, going on without her. I'd been back in school about a week when my best friend Rena finally convinced me to try out for cheerleading. She argued that it was one of the few things Cass had never done, and therefore I was pretty much required to do it. I wasn't so sure about this. She never did it for a reason, I told her as we walked into the gym for tryouts after school. Getting adjusted to school after a long, lazy summer had been tough, not to mention the occasional whispers or stares from people who knew about Cass running away. She'd been well known at school, and it was great end of the summer gossip, earning me a newfound notoriety that made me very uncomfortable. "And what reason was that?" Rena asked me. "Because she was an athlete," I said. I was realizing that more and more I was referring to Cass in the past tense, as if she was dead and not just gone. Not a Barbie doll. "Cheerleading is a sport," Rena said firmly. "And besides, you get to go to all the good parties." I sighed, shaking my head. Rena and I were mismatched as friends, but somehow we'd stuck together since 7th grade, when she moved into town with her mom from Boca Raton to live with stepdad number 2, the dry cleaning king, across the street from us. All the girls hated her immediately because she was flat out gorgeous even then, tall with a perfect figure, strawberry blonde curls, huge blue eyes, and full lips and a heart-shaped face. Her arrival at Jackson Middle preceded the breakup of 2 well-established couples, as well as marking the beginning of a reputation built more on speculation and wishful thinking than the truth, which had followed her since. But I knew Rena. I knew she only chased boys because her father, who hosted a kids' cartoon show in Boco called Harvey's Heroes, had refused to acknowledge her as his daughter, even after a blood test proved otherwise. She told me that as a kid she watched his show every day, and that he was great with children in the audience, so funny and silly, pulling rabbits out of his hat or telling stupid jokes. "He just seemed like he'd be the perfect dad, you know," she said, "and all I could think was that he hated me, but I still watched, every day. I don't even know why." Rena's mom, Lisa, also tall, blonde, and gorgeous, kept remarrying, and Rena got trips, clothes, jewelry, and big rooms in nice houses with her own TV and phone. The love she wanted, she learned to look for elsewhere, with mixed results. At the beginning of 9th grade, Lisa had an affair with her boss and moved Rena across town, divorcing number 2 to live with the man who would soon become number 3. My mother breathed a sigh of relief, thinking now I could find a nicer girl to be friends with, but I knew Rena, like me, didn't make friends very easily. And she was good to me, strong, fun, and fiercely loyal. And if I didn't have many other friends because of her, most girls were intimidated by her looks or the thought she was too pushy or just flat out feared for their boyfriends. It never bothered me. I never missed having a wide, thick circle of girlfriends. Rena was more than enough. We were comfortable with each other's flaws and weaknesses, so we stuck together and kept to ourselves. And once my mother realized that I wasn't going to start wearing tight skirts and dating half the basketball team, so Rena-esque, she relaxed and got used to her as well. She always liked to see Rena as needing structure. It was all those divorces. So she took to inviting her to dinners and holidays and on our yearly beach trip, folding her into our extended family. Now, as we walked into the gym, a pack of girls by the bleachers turned to look at us, narrowing their eyes, mouths already whispering. This was the standard reaction to Rena. Anywhere we went, from Walmart to the movies, from both strangers and schoolmates. It had always bothered me. I was protective of her, but she didn't even seem to notice anymore. "I don't want to do this," I complained, even as she was writing both our names down at the table sign-up, which was manned by Chelsea Robbins, head cheerleader, runner-up to Cass for homecoming queen the year before. "Sure you do," Rena said easily, flashing her $1,000,000 smile at Chelsea, who smiled back just as fake, tossing her blonde ponytail. It'll be fun. So, Caitlin, Chelsea asked me, how are you doing? I looked at her. Her head was cocked to the side, her face serious. Fine, I said. She nodded, sympathetic, and dipped her blonde head in a voice a little lower before adding, I can't believe it about Cass. I mean, she never struck me as that type. I had a sudden flash of Chelsea standing on the homecoming float in her runner-up sash, waving with a perky smile that couldn't completely hide the fact that she was bitter she'd been beaten. What type is that? I asked her. Her big blue eyes widened. Well, I mean, I just think she was going to yell and all. She, totally flaked out, right? Come on, Caitlin, Rena said, locking her fingers around my wrist. What I was feeling was new for me, a bubbling up of anger mixed with so many images from the last 2 weeks. My mother weeping, my father running his hand over his head, closing his eyes, Cass's name doodled on the back of that envelope, her inscription to me in blue ink, see you there. Rena yanked me by the arm hard and began to pull away. Good luck, Chelsea yelled after us. After I tried to turn back, but Rena held me tight. Someone was blowing a whistle. Tryouts were starting. Caitlin, Rena said in a low voice, I feel like I could fight as well as the next person, but did you hear what she was saying? She's a bitch, Rena said flatly, plopping down on the bleachers, crossing her legs. 2 heavy-set girls sitting further down looked over at her, their eyes traveling up and down Rena from her face to her toes. She ignored them. We knew that already, but starting something now would blow our chances at cheerleading, and we don't want to do that, do we? Yes, I said. She sighed, reaching up to fluff her curls. Do this for me, okay? I promise you'll thank me later. Trust me. I looked at her. Those 2 little words had gotten me in more trouble than I'd care to remember. Okay, fine, she said quickly. Do what Cass would do then. And what's that? I said. She shook her head. You don't know? From the middle of the gym floor, Chelsea Robbins began, clapping her hands together. Okay, ladies, it's time to get started. We're going to show you a basic routine to learn for the first cuts. Let's go. Rena turned and smiled at me. Kick their butts, she said, standing up. That's what Cass would do. At least 200 girls were milling around the gym floor, stretching and talking. I was sure they all wanted this more than I did, but still, kick their butts, I repeated, as if it would be that simple, watching Chelsea Robbins cartwheel down the gym, showing off her bounce and pep. Okay. When I bought my cheerleading uniform home 3 days later, I saw Boo coming, but didn't move fast enough. She intercepted me on the front porch, leaving from a visit to my mother. Hello, she said cheerfully. I've been working on your mother for the last hour to join this pottery class with me. You know, something to get her out the house, but she's so stubborn. The uniform was folded over my arm, and I tried to shift it behind me. That's great, I said. Well, she's not firm on it yet, she said, craning her neck as I slipped the uniform around my back. What's that? I don't think, I said, but it was too late. She had it now, pulling it around me to hold up in front of me. Oh, she gasped, one hand moving to cover her mouth. I felt my face burn, ashamed, as deep red as the raised JHS on the sweater. As far as Boo concerned, I might as well have joined the clan. Oh, goodness. I know what you're going to say, I began, but no, she said quickly, handing it back to me. That's great. Good for you. It was Rena's idea, I said, feeling so lame I could hardly stand it. Boo, a professor of women's studies, had fundamental problems with pageants, the beauty industry, and of course cheerleading. I knew this. It's okay, she said to me calmly, smiling now. Whatever makes you happy. It's not making me happy, I explained hastily. It's just kind of happened. And it had. 1 minute I've been hating every second, the next so fired up that no one could stop me. I had my one requisite year of gymnastics. I could do handsprings and cartwheels, but in the process of showing them and channeling Cass to kick their butts, I'd gotten picked for the squad. The rest was just a blur of the squad hugging me and pom-poms rustling in my face. Rena had made it too, mostly because of half the judges were football players. I understand, Boo said, pulling back and holding me at arm's length. These things sometimes just do that. They just, and she looked at my uniform, brushing her hand over the sweater, happen. And before I could say anything, she squeezed my arm and went down the stairs, her clogs thunking across the walk into the grass. When I went into my room, I held the uniform against me, trying to picture myself cartwheeling across the football field. It was hard. There was a knock on the door. "Caitlin," my mother called. "Are you in there?" "Yeah," I said. "Come on in." She opened the door and stuck her head in. She put on fresh lipstick and a squirt of joy perfume, which I could smell, just as she did every day before my father was due home. She looked nice, but her face had that hollow look it had taken on since Cass left, like she was in a shell, like she was just a shell of her former self, functioning and talking, but hardly alive. "How was school?" "Fine." I turned around, holding up the uniform against me. "I made the cheerleading squad." "Really?" Her face brightened as she stepped into my room, clasping her hands. "Oh, Caitlin, that's great! Why didn't you tell me you were going out for the team?" "It just kind of happened," I said. She walked right past where I was sitting to the chair where my uniform was, picking it up and holding it in front of her. "Well, look at that," she said excitedly. "It's just gorgeous. Now you can't just leave this here. It needs to be hung up, and this sweater looks like a good dry cleaning couldn't hurt in it." "Okay," I said. Oh, I hadn't seen her so excited about anything since Cass left. "Now, did they tell you what kind of shoes you need? And what's the practice schedule like?" She walked to my closet and hung up the uniform, smoothing the skirt with her hand as she did so. "I can't believe they only give you one. We'll have to keep it really clean if you have a lot of games." I could see her mind already working over this problem as she examined the fabric of the skirt, turning it in her hand. "There's a meeting tomorrow," I said. I was starting to feel a little strange about this now. "I think they tell me everything then." "All we got today was a game schedule," I added, pulling out of my pocket. She was standing in front of me immediately, hand out, ready to take it. She unfolded the paper and then scanned it quickly. "My," she said, "you are going to be busy, but we'll work around it. We always have before, right?" Right," I said. This "we" thing was kind of strange considering I'd never been involved in any school team so far. It was like she'd forgotten I was even there. She was already on her way to the door, the schedule in her hand. "I'm going to stick this on the fridge right now so we'll know when you need to be where. And tomorrow night, after they tell you what you need, we'll go to the mall, okay? Unless they have to special order things from a catalog, in which case maybe I should just go ahead and write you a check to take with you." "I don't know," I said quietly. "Well, I'll just send a blank one with you, and that way if they're ordering you can go ahead and do it right away. You don't want to wait too long, unless they all order in a group together." "I don't know," I said again. My stomach was starting to hurt. "Well, we'll figure it out later," she said, beaming and waving the paper before me before she disappeared down the hall. I knew she was pulling the scotch tape out of the drawer by the stove, centering the paper on the fridge in the exact spot where Cass's soccer student government debate club Yale schedule had always been. The only reason I'd even tried out was to do something different from Cass, but here, in the end, I was following her again. I looked out my window to Boo and Stuart's. They were cooking dinner. Stuart was peeling carrots and talking, while Boo stirred something on the stove with a long wooden spoon and a glass of wine in her other hand. And I wished again that I was their daughter, just once, sitting in that kitchen eating spicy greens, peeled carrots, and just being me. One time, when I was about 8 or 9, Boo was watching me at her house. I had my Barbie bedroom carrying case and was dressing my Barbie for a big date with Ken, who was half naked on the floor, waiting for me to find his blue velour pants. "So, what's your doll's name?" Boo asked me. "Barbie," I said. "All their names are Barbie." "I see," she said. "Well, I think that would get boring, everyone having the same name." I thought about this and said, "Okay, then her name is Sabrina." "Well, that's a very nice name," Boo said. I remember she was baking bread, kneading the dough between her thick fingers. "What does she do?" "Do?" I said. "Yes." She flipped the dough over and started in on it from the other side. "What does she do?" "She goes out with Ken," I said. "And what else?" "She goes to parties," I said slowly, "and shopping." "Oh," Boo said, nodding. "She can't work?" "She doesn't have to work," I said. "Why not?" "Because she's Barbie. I hate to tell you, Caitlin, but somebody has to make the payments on that townhouse and the Corvette," Boo said cheerfully, "unless Barbie has a lot of family money." I considered this while I put on Ken's pants. Boo started pushing the dough into a pan, smoothing it with her hand over the top. "You know what I think, Caitlin?" Her voice was soft, the way she always spoke to me. "What?" "I think your Barbie can go shopping and go out with Ken and have a productive and satisfying career of her own." She opened the rack and slid in the bread pan, adjusting its position on the rack. But what can she do? My mother didn't work and spent her time cleaning the house and going to PTA. I couldn't imagine Barbie, whose most casual outfits had sequins and go-go boots, doing such things. Boo came over and plopped down right beside me. I always remember her being on my level. She'd sit at the edge of the sandbox or lie across her bed with me and Cass as we listened to the radio. "Well," she said thoughtfully, picking up Ken and examining his perfect physique. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I remember this moment so well. I can see Boo sitting there on the floor cross-legged, holding my Ken and watching my face as she tried to make me see that between my mother's PTA and Boo's strange ways there was a middle ground that began here with my Barbie, Sabrina, and led right to me. "Well," I said abruptly, "I want to be in advertising." I had no idea where this came from. "Advertising," Boo repeated, nodding. "Okay, advertising it is. So Sabrina has to go to work every day, coming up with ideas for commercials and things like that. She works in an office," I went on. "Sometimes she has to work late." "Sure she does," Boo said. "It's hard to get ahead even if you're Barbie." "Because she wants to get promoted," I added, "so she can pay off the townhouse and the Corvette." "Very responsible of her," Boo said. "Can she be divorced?" I asked, "and famous for her commercials and ideas?" "She can be anything," Boo told me, and this was what I remembered the most, her freckled face, so solemn, as if she knew she was the first to tell me. "And so can you." And now I found myself a cheerleader, using pom-poms and pyramids to forge my way into new and unbroken territory. I wondered again what Cass would think of me. Would she be disappointed, like Boo, or ecstatic, like my mother? If I knew my sister, she'd be a little of both. Every year for as long as I could remember, my family and Boo and Stuart have always had an end of the summer cookout to celebrate Labor Day. This year, with Cass gone, I wondered if we'd stick with the tradition or just let it go. It was hard to say. In the end, it was my mother who made the call. "Well," she said to Boo the weekend before, over coffee, "I suppose Cassandra would be gone anyways. Freshman orientation started on the 3rd. As she said this, she glanced over to the fridge where the Yale calendar still hung next to Cass's junior prom picture in the grocery list. It was the one reminder of Cass's thwarted college plans that she hadn't taken down yet. "Exactly," Boo said, taking another grape out of the bowl in front of her and tossing it into her mouth. "Besides, it's bad luck to mess with tradition, and I have a wonderfully new recipe for eggplant pasta salad that will knock your socks off." My mother smiled at this. "I suppose I'll make my ambrosia salad then," she said, stirring her coffee with a clink of her spoon. "And Jack can handle the steaks, like always." "Stuart will make his famous tempeh fajitas," Boo added. "What about you, Caitlin? What can you make for us?" I thought about this. My biggest contribution was usually lighting the grill. Cass had been famous for her chocolate chip cheesecake. It was the only thing she could make, and it was always a huge production involving her taking over the entire kitchen. She'd bang pans, mumbling and cursing to herself before finally emerging with a somewhat lopsided, always delicious dessert. As a vegetarian dish, it was loved all around, unless Stuart was in a vegan cycle, which meant more for the rest of us. The image of Cass in the kitchen with her face smeared with flour, using a spatula to shoo us all out of the kitchen as we tried to help her, always symbolized more than the pool closing, cooler nights, and homework the end of the summer to me. In the end, I made the coleslaw. It was, after all, a summer dish. My mother turned on the bug light. Boo brought a huge bouquet of the last of her zinnias and cosmos, and my father flipped the steaks on the patio and drank beer with Stuart, who had pre-cooked his fajitas to avoid any meat tempeh interaction. My mother and Boo took their wine glasses and went for a stroll in the yard, already discussing fall bulbs, while I went inside and turned on the football game for my father, who could half watch it while keeping an eye on the steaks. The bugs were out in force, and since Stuart had a conscientious objection to bug light, he winced, as if in pain himself, each time it claimed another victim. "Well, I hear we have quite a team this year," said Stuart, trying to make conversation. He knew nothing about sports and had lost our respect years ago by asking how many points a basket counted for while watching the second half of an NCAA Final Four game. Quarterback's good, my father said, head poking at a steak with a fork, but the defensive line needs help. A good rushing team and we're in trouble. Ah, Stewart said, nodding. A bug flew in the light, bzz, and he sighed. Right. What's that score say, Caitlin? My father asked me, squinting through the patio door. I'll go check, I said, picking up my Coke and going inside. 10-17. Nebraska's up. Good, my father said, flipping another steak. I was standing in front of the TV, watching the offense get organized, when Stewart said in a lower voice, Is there any news about Cassandra? I glanced outside at my father, who didn't even flinch at the sound of her name. We'd all been acting like things were fine. It was just another Labor Day. I was back at school, and Cass was at Yale. There was her schedule up on the fridge. No, my father said in his press conference, news-sounding bite voice. Nothing new. Stewart nodded, rubbing his hand over his chin. I know this probably doesn't help, he said. Stewart, who prided himself on being fully in touch with his emotions, was the complete polar opposite of my stoic father. But I took Boo away from her family when she was 18. We were just kids, of course, and it was stupid, and it took years for her parents to forgive me. My father flipped another steak and then pushed down on it hard with the spatula. A bug flew into the light, dying a loud, noisy death. But I took good care of her, Stewart went on. And I know that Adam is doing the same for Cassandra. She's such a smart girl. She wouldn't be with anyone who'd do anything less. My father, with those nerves of steel, didn't react to this except by one solid nod. Outside, I could hear my mother laughing, her and Boo's voices getting closer. Well, my father said, glancing in again at the game as the quarterback ran down the field, dodging and twisting, ducking and rushing, all the way to the end zone. I hope you're right. They were quiet after that, with just the sizzle of the steaks and the bug lighting buzzing every few minutes. It was getting dark outside and the food was almost ready, so I went into the kitchen, watched the sunset, and ate ambrosia salad with my fingers at the end of this. Another summer.